So part 2 of the video for section 5.1 leads off with a new skill. And the instructions for the next group of problems say to factor out a negative from each polynomial. I could have said factor out a -1 from each polynomial. These are equivalent questions. When I look at the binomials on this sheet, there isn't a common factor other than 1 because both terms don't have the same variable, so there's not a variable part for a greatest common factor. And the biggest number that divides into the coefficients is 1. Like the common factor, the largest common factor between 3 and 5 is 1. So there isn't a common factor, but the first term in each of the binomials on this sheet is as a negative number. And generally, if we have a binomial that leads with a negative number, it's common to rewrite it by factoring out a negative or rewrite it by factoring out a -1, which is equivalent. So let me show you how to do that. In problem 18, I'm going to factor out a negative. I'm going to use a 1 with the negative because it makes it easier to follow the math. So if I factor out a -1, how do I figure out what goes inside the parentheses? Super easy. It's not a new skill. It's a skill that we know already. I'm going to write the original problem inside my parentheses and divide it by the common factor. First division, -3 divided by -1 is +3. First division, I keep the x. After the plus sign, 5 divided by -1 is -5. And I don't like two signs next to each other, so I might insert that extra parentheses. And plus a negative is the same as minus the positive version of that. 3x plus -5 is the same as 3x minus 5. I claim that this is what I'm looking for. Either version of this. The 1 is normally suppressed, but the 1 makes it so much easier for explaining, and it makes it so much easier for checking. How do I know that this is right? Well, I check. I distribute and make sure I wind up with my original problem. So I'll do -1 times 3x and -1 times -5. -1 times 3x is -3x. -1 times -5 is +5. That equals my original problem, so I know I factored correctly. That's the formal way to factor out a negative or to factor out a -1. The informal way is if I factor out a negative or equivalently factor out a -1, to fill up my parentheses, I just change the signs. You'll notice that this -3x wound up as +3x. This +5 wound up as -5 in my answer. So we never would do this much work to factor out a -1. It's supposed to be a one-step simple process. So if I was working on problem 20 and factoring out a -1 or equivalently a negative, I would just write a parentheses, precede the parentheses with my preference of a -1 or just a negative sign, and inside the parentheses change the signs. -x goes to +x, -4 goes to +4. And that would be it. This would be completely factored. One simple, quick step. Each of the next few problems have the same instruction. I'll do them all because I could do these way fast. To factor out a negative or equivalently a -1 from the binomial 7x plus 16. Inside the parentheses, I flip the signs. So I'm going to have a 7w minus 16. Factoring out a negative causes me to flip signs. 24. Same strategy. As long as I change every sign, I'm good. And then I like the 1s with the negatives. It makes it so much easier when I'm checking. It's a cleaner looking answer without the 1. they're equal to each other. I'm going to skip on 26. I don't think I need another one of these. And now we're going to integrate the skill of finding the greatest common factor with factoring out a negative in a new kind of problem. The instructions for the next group of problems is ultimately going to be rewrite by factoring out the opposite of the GCF. Essentially, it's going to be rewrite by factoring the GCF with a negative sign in front of it. So how do I do this skill? Rewrite by factoring out the opposite of the GCF. Well, first I find the GCF. If I look at the coefficients without the signs, the numbers are 24 and 18. And I'm going to write down the factors, the only factors that I need for the GCF to speed up the process. The factors of 24 that are going to be important in finding the GCF are 4 and 6. The factors of 8 that are going to be important in finding the GCF are 3 and 6. The greatest common factor of the coefficients is 6. When I look at the variable part, the 24x has a variable of x. The 18 doesn't have a variable of x, so there's not a variable in my greatest common factor. Between the 24x, or between the negative 24x and the 18, the greatest common factor is the number 6. I'm asked to find the opposite of the greatest common factor and factor it out. The opposite of 6 is negative 6. So now I'm going to formally factor out the greatest common factor of negative 6 and complete my factoring. Eventually I'm going to get informal and do it how we need to do it in our head. So how do I factor out anything? Well, I put that term in front of a parentheses, and inside the parentheses I take the given problem, put it in the numerator of fractions with what I factored out front in the denominator of fractions. I could actually do that. Sorry. So that would be considered factoring out the greatest common factor, and now it's just reducing. I'm going to leave the negative 6 out front, reduce the fraction, negative 24 over negative 6. Two negatives cancel out to be a positive. Then the coefficient part's going to be a 4. I'm going to leave the x. After the plus sign, 18 divided by negative 6 is negative 3. Usually I don't leave the two signs next to each other. And a plus and negative I can make into a minus. This is going to be considered the rewrite by factoring out the opposite of the greatest common factor. I can check this, and I checked it off to the side here. I went negative 6 times 4x and negative 6 times negative 3. Negative 6 times 4x is negative 24x. Brought down my minus. Negative 6 times negative 3 is negative 18. Made the double negative into a plus. It matches the original, so I know I'm correct. So this is the next skill, but we should definitely work on trying to just get some work done in our head rather than showing everything by hand. Alright. I'm looking at some of my work. Oh, it's supposed to go to 27. I see. Okay. So the next skill is factoring by removing the opposite of the greatest common factor. So let's work on that now. So let's look at problem 28. First, I'm going to find the common factor. I'm going to look at the coefficients of 20 and 15 and pick out the common factor. The factors that I'm going to need for 20 to pull out the greatest common factor are 4 and 5. The factors of 15 that I'm going to need are 3 and 5. You're welcome to use this sheet. And I looked at 15 and I looked at 20, and I know what the greatest common factor is. This I should be doing in my head. but part of the greatest common factor is going to be the number 5. And then I'm going to look at the y squared and the y. They both have a y, so my greatest common factor is going to be the smaller exponent. In some sense, I could just factor out a 5y, but then my answer wouldn't be written how it would be customarily answered. So I found the greatest common factor, and now I'm going to find the opposite of it. And that's what I'm going to write in front of my parentheses. And now I'm going to start to factor in my head. I'll try to talk through what I'm doing. I don't know how well it's going to work, but we need to get to that point. So immediately when I put the opposite of the greatest common factor inside a parentheses, I have to decide what goes in front of the inside the parentheses. I factored out a negative, so my negative sign here is going to change to positive. So my first sign would be positive, but I don't need to write a plus sign. It's going to be as assumed. I factored out a 5, so I'm going to divide that 20 by 5 and get a 4. I factored out a y. The first term had 2 y's. I factored out 1 y. I'm left with 1 y. Move on. I factored out a minus sign, so that minus sign is going to change to plus. I factored out a 5, so I'm going to divide that 15 by 5 and get a 3. I factored out a y, so that y is going to be gone. I claim that this is the answer factored in my head, which is the skill that we really need to have. So let me check. To check, I'm going to go minus 5y times positive 4y and minus 5y times positive 3. The first multiplication, I multiply minus 5 times 4 and get minus 20. I multiply y times y and get y squared. Second multiplication, I do minus 3 times 5 and get minus 15, and I leave the y. It matches perfectly with my original, so I know my answer checks. Let's do 29 together just because my 30 is too low on my sheet. So first I'm going to find the greatest common factor. The factors of 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. The factors of 4 are 1 and 4, and 2 and 2. The factors of 8 are 1 and 8, and 2 and 4. The numerical part of the greatest common factor is going to be 4. Then I'll look at the variables, x cubed, x squared, and x. Each term has an x. I'll take the smaller of the exponents, or smallest of the exponents. The greatest common factor between these 3 terms would be 4x, but because the first term is negative, I want to factor out the opposite of the greatest common factor. So I'm going to factor out a negative 4x in my head. So let me just write above here what I'm dealing with. So factoring out the opposite, signs are going to change. First term inside my parentheses, it was negative. I factored out a negative, so the sign's going to change to positive. I don't need to write a plus sign when it's first. The plus sign's assumed. I started with a 12. I factored out a 4. I'll go 12 divided by 4 is 3. I started with 3 x's. I factored out 1 x. I'm going to be left with 2 x's. Next term. It had a positive in front of it. I factored out a negative. I need to change the sign. It had a 4 in front of it. I factored out a 4. I need to divide the 4 by 4 and I'll get a 1. So I'm not going to write the 1 because there's going to be an x part left. I had 2 x's. I factored out 1x. I'm left with 1x. Last piece of my answer. There was a minus sign. I factored out a negative. I need to change the sign to plus. I had an 8. I factored out a 4. I'm going to divide the 8 by 4 and get a 2. I factored out the x, so I don't need an x. I claim that's going to be my answer to problem 29. It looks right. And I'm not going to check it because of its time issue. But I should if I have the time. So, 32. Find the greatest common factor. I look at the factors of 5. They're 1 and 5. The factors of 10 are 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. The number part of my common factor is going to be a 5. Both terms have a y. I take the smaller exponent. The greatest common factor is 5y squared, but because the first term is negative, it was customary, even if I wasn't asked, it would be customary to factor out the opposite of the greatest common factor. So I'm going to put negative 5y squared in front of a parentheses, and then I'll figure out what to put inside the parentheses. First term was negative. I factored out a negative, so the first term in my parentheses needs to be positive. The 5, that's the coefficient. I'll divide by the 5 that I factored out and get a 1. Don't need to write the 1 if there's more to write. The y cubed that I started with, I'm going to subtract 2 from its exponent and get a y to the first. So my parentheses is going to lead off with a positive y. And then for the plus 10y squared, the positive changes to negative because I factored out a negative. The 10, I'm going to divide by 5 and get 2. And I took out the y squared, so I don't need a variable. Claim that's the answer to question 32. Let's do 33 together. Let me get the common factor between 6 and 14. The common factor between 6 and 14 is a 2. And now I'll work on the variables. Both terms have an a. I need the smaller exponent. Both terms have a b. I need the smaller exponent. So I'm just going to write down the opposite of the GCF because that's what I need. I could write the GCF down and then write its opposite, but that's inefficient. So the opposite of the GCF is going to be negative 2a squared b. I don't even need to write that down as a sentence. I can just write it. So, but that's what I'm going to factor out. To start my parentheses, filling up the inside, the first term had a negative 14. I factored out a negative, so I'm going to get a positive. The 14 I'm going to divide by 2 and get a 7. First term had 4 a's. I factored out 2 a's. Forgot an exponent on the b. First term had 4 a's. I factored out 2 a's. I'm going to be left with 2 a's. The first term had 2 b's. I factored out 1 b. I'm left with 1 b. Now I'll move on to the second term. Second term led with a negative. I factored out a negative. I'm going to flip the sign and make it a positive. The second term led with a 6. I'll divide the 6 by 2 and get a 3. I factored out the a squared. I factored out the b. I don't get a variable part. That would be my answer for 33. We're definitely going to get a part 4, so sorry. The part 4 will be quick, but it needs to happen. So 36, and then we'll pause and do a part 4. 36, let me work on the coefficients of 15, 12, and 9. The factors that are going to be important are the 3 and the 5 for the 15, the 3 and the 4 for the 12, the 3 and the 3 for the 9. The number part of my greatest common factor is going to be 3. For the variables, for the x's, they all have an x, and the smallest exponent is an x to the first. For the y's, they all have a y, and the smallest exponent is y to the first. And for the z's, they all have a z, and the smallest exponent is z to the first. So the greatest common factor would be 3x, y, z. I'm going to factor out the opposite of the greatest common factor, so I'll put a negative up front. And now, one term at a time. First term, the negative sign's going to flip to positive. 15 I'm going to divide by 3 and get a 5. First term had 2 x's. I took 1 x away. I'll be left with 1 x. The first term had 1 y and 1 z. I took them away. Next term, it was positive. I factored out a negative, so I'll write a negative. 12, I'll divide by 3 and get 4. Second term had 2 x's. I took 1 x out. I'm left with 1 x. Second term had 3 y's. I took 1 y out. I'm left with 2 y's. Second term had 3 z's. I took 1 z out. I'm left with 2 z's. Last term, I factored out a negative, so the sign's going to flip to positive. The 9 that I started with, I'll divide by 3 and be left with a 3. I factored out one of the x's. I factored out the x, the y, and the z. I claim that's going to be my answer for 36. So we get a new skill, and it's kind of nice. It's going to be in its own video because it's the link between sections 5.1 and then to 5.2.